Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In this video, we're going to be discussing some of the basics of herd immunity. We'll discuss the concept of herd immunity as it relates to different pathogens, and then we'll talk about what's called the basic reproduction number, which is something that can be quantified for any disease or pathogen, and we'll talk about what the purpose of that basic reproduction number is and what you can do with it. Okay? So first, let's discuss the basic idea of herd immunity. What is a herd? A herd is a group of individuals, right? Immunity just means that a person does not have the susceptibility to a particular infection, meaning that they cannot become infected with that particular pathogen. Okay? They've already developed immunity to it. So if you have herd immunity, it refers to this idea that a bunch of people or a percentage of a population can become immune to a particular pathogen. And as the percentage of individuals who are immune to that particular pathogen increases, you have a decreased likelihood that that particular pathogen can spread. And at some point, if a certain percentage of the population are immune to a particular disease, a particular pathogen, such as the ones listed right here, then you can pretty much say that you've effectively limited the spread of that pathogen and you have what's called herd immunity. And the percentage of individuals that need to be immunized in order to have herd immunity depends on the conditions, and it depends on the pathogen causing the disease. Is it the pathogen causing the chicken pox? Is it the pathogen causing COVID-19, or is it the pathogen causing AIDS, and so on and so forth. And so depending on what disease you have and the conditions, that percentage that needs to be effectively immunized in order to have herd immunity changes. Okay, so let's get a very abstract idea of this. Okay, so let's suppose this is a lecture hall right here. There's 100 students here. Each dot represents, or each circle represents, a student. So there's 100 students here. The blue circles represent students or people that are not immunized to whatever the pathogen is we're talking about. And these dark red circles represent people who are infected with the pathogen. Now, obviously, in a classroom, 100 students like this, everyone's in close quarters to one another, and so it might be expected that this person right here who's infected with the pathogen might infect the people around them. The same thing goes for this person right here. They are infected with the pathogen as well, so it would be expected that the people around them would also become infected because these blue circles represent people who are not immunized. And so the result of a situation like this is you might initially get something like this. Okay? So these red circles represent people who were infected by the individual with the dark red circle. Okay? The blue people are still not infected, but they're also not yet immunized. And so initially, you're going to have a bunch of people in close proximity to the person who is originally infected that also to become infected. And so you see two different areas here of these red circles where there's an infection spreading, and it all has to do with their proximity to this original person right here. One right here in the top right corner, one here in the bottom left corner. And if you let this progress, you might even get even more people infected. You might not get every single person infected. In fact, we wouldn't expect every single person to become infected. But the more infectious the pathogen is, the more infections you're going to have for people that are not immunized against that particular pathogen. And so this might be what you would expect in a case where no one is immunized against the pathogen, but there are even just 2 individuals here that have the pathogen and are able to spread whatever the disease is. Okay? All right, now let's look at another situation. So in this situation, it's very similar. The blue circles are going to represent people not yet immunized. The dark red circles are 2 people that have the pathogen, they have the disease, and are able to spread it to anyone who's not immunized. But we're going to throw in some gold circles. And these gold circles represent people who, for whatever reason, are immune to the pathogen. Let's first look at this dark red circle at the bottom left of the grid. Okay? There's 8 circles surrounding it, and 6 of those, this one, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, these blue circles, of course, are people who are not immunized against the pathogen. But these 2, which are in direct contact, are immunized. So these 2 gold circles, these people, are not going to become infected by this individual. And so maybe, because this person can't be infected, right here in gold, it might limit the spread of the disease kind of in this direction over here. Likewise, this person cannot be infected below, so it might limit the spread of the infection down here. But over directly to the right, this person can become infected because they're not yet immunized. So this person could catch the disease from the red dot, and then it could spread it over here in this direction. And so if we let this pathogen spread, naturally, we might end up with a situation that looks like this. Again, where the red circles represent individuals who are infected by these two original people infected by the pathogen. Okay? Now, what I want you to notice here are three things. One, we still have individuals who are not immunized, but if we compare this situation where we have originally people immunized to the original one where no one was immunized, notice that when there's no one immunized against the pathogen appears to spread more profusely throughout the population. Okay? When there's some people immunized, you still get spread of the disease, but it appears that having some people immunized actually reduces at least the rate that this pathogen spreads. It's not to say that this person and this person and this person, that these people cannot catch the pathogen. They might eventually. But what we can start to see here is that the more people are immunized against the pathogen, the harder it is for the pathogen to spread. Now there's going to come a point at which there's going to be so many people immunized against the pathogen that you make it almost impossible, or at least very, very difficult for the pathogen to spread. So consider this case right here. So again, the red dots represent people who are infected with the pathogen. The blue dots represent people who are not immunized, but all these gold circles again represent people who are immunized against the pathogen. And so in this case, you might actually have herd immunity. So even though there's people that are not immunized against the pathogen, there's so many people who are immunized, these gold circles, that they may actually limit the spread of the disease basically by probability. And in this situation, you might have so many people who are immunized against the pathogen that the entire population of 100 people here have herd immunity. Okay? Which basically means that enough people are immunized against the pathogen that these people probably won't get infected, or there's a very low likelihood that they will be infected. Okay? Notice that this red dot right here, this individual who's infected with the pathogen, is completely surrounded by individuals who are immunized. So there's no way that any of these 8 people can be infected by the pathogen. They're already immunized. And I guess this person, if they did come into proximity with the red dot, they would be infected, but they're far enough away from the individual who's infected that there's a low likelihood that they would actually become infected. Okay? And so the idea with herd immunity is that if you have enough people who are immunized against the pathogen, that even though there's some people who are not immunized, they will have some protection because the probability that they will come in contact with someone who's infected is a lot lower. You can even take this same situation and apply it to shopping at Walmart. So suppose you do a very irresponsible thing and you are one of these 2 people who are infected with a pathogen and it has a horrible disease associated with it. And you go into this Walmart, right? Well, if in the Walmart there's 100 people shopping, like you have here, and there's a huge percentage of people who are immunized against that pathogen that you're carrying, then there's a lower likelihood or a lower probability that you'd actually run into any of the people who are not immunized. Okay? Especially with how big Walmart is. So if you've got 100 people in there, you're infected, you are going to have a much higher likelihood of running into these people who are immunized than you would the people who are not immunized. And so these people who are not immunized are conferred some protection from the pathogen because there's so many people who are immunized against the pathogen, and there's a smaller probability that you'd run into somebody who did have the pathogen. Okay? So hopefully this makes sense. And that's going to lead us into a concept that we're going to talk about here called the basic reproduction number. Now this is a number that's designated as R sub 0 or R naught. Okay? And this is defined as the expected number of cases directly generated by one case in a population where all individuals are susceptible to an infection. So go back to this example right here. So you've got here one person infected, we'll just consider this one, and everyone else in the population except for this guy right here is susceptible to the infection because they're not immunized. Remember, that's what the blue circles mean. Okay? So let's count the number of people that this guy is able to directly infect. Right? So let's go to this right here. So I'll assume that all of these in red in this upper right quadrant are people he infected. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Okay? So it appears that this one guy right here was able to directly infect 18 people, let's say. So the R sub 0, or R naught, the basic reproduction number for that particular pathogen in that case would be 18. Now, as you can kind of tell from this table right here of values for R naught, 18 is a really, really, really dangerous pathogen if that's its basic reproduction number. But if we took a look at, let's say, polio right here, and this is, of course, the fecal-oral route for polio, the R naught is between 5 and 7, and it depends on the conditions, it depends on the study, so you'll typically see a range for this. What that means is that in this study that found that polio had a basic reproduction number of 5, that means that if one individual had polio, the polio virus, they could infect directly 5 people on average. Another study, maybe this one over here, found that one individual infected with polio could infect 7 other people. Okay? That's basically what the basic reproduction number R naught is. Okay? Now, a few other things about R naught before we get into why it's important. You can kind of tell it here, it's not a biological constant for a pathogen. Okay? So for example, with AIDS, okay, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, is the pathogen that causes AIDS. Okay? You can tell it's a range here because it depends on the conditions. It's not a biological constant. If it were a constant, it'd just be one number, but it's given as a range, in this case from 2 to 5. Okay? So the R naught value is affected by the environmental conditions. It's affected by the behavior of the infected population. So if the infected population is being really smart about things and they're staying away from other individuals and not spreading the pathogen, then you might have a different situation than if people are going out and touching a bunch of other people and breathing on people, whatever the case may be. So that would cause R naught to be something entirely different. Also, the environmental conditions, there can be things like humidity, heat, salinity, all sorts of stuff can affect how that pathogen spreads, and that would of course affect its R naught value. And the other thing right here is that the R naught values are estimated from mathematical models. And so first of all, the exact value that comes out of that depends on the model, and certain models are only used under certain conditions. And so the values that you're looking at only make sense in a given context. Okay? But when we do a calculation in a minute, we're actually going to use these values right here. And then here's another important point. The R naught value does not give an estimate of how fast an infection spreads through the population. Okay? And the reason for that is because R naught is greatly affected by environmental conditions and the behavior of the infected population. Okay? So if the infected population, and also the non-immunized population, if they're being really stupid about how they're avoiding other people or how they're taking precautions, then the R naught value is going to be a lot higher. We would expect it to be higher because you're creating an environment that makes it easier for the pathogen to spread. So again, there's other factors that play a role in how fast the infection spreads. However, if I'm looking at this table, generally speaking, I could probably say that Ebola or influenza, based on these R naught values, which are lower, they don't spread near as easily as something like measles with an R naught value of anywhere between 12 and 18. Okay? So you can kind of look at this and give a relative estimate of how fast it's going to spread, assuming you keep most of the conditions the same. So what can you do with this basic reproduction number? Well, there's 4 things I have listed here, and they kind of all blend together, so I may end up doing them in no particular order, but let's look at them. The first thing is you can determine if an emerging infectious disease can spread through a population. Okay? I'm actually going to go down to bullet point 3 right here because it actually has to do with 1. Generally, when you're looking at the R naught values, and we can look at this table right here, the larger the value of R naught, the harder it is to control the epidemic. Okay? So in other words, the higher the R naught value, the easier the pathogen can spread through the population. So like I mentioned, influenza and Ebola, these have R naughts, it appears, anywhere between 1 and 3. So here influenza is 1.4 to 2.8. Ebola back in 2014 is about 1.5 to 1.9. These 2 pathogens will not spread anywhere near as easily as measles would, okay, which has an R naught of 12 to 18, right? Also, if you look at the value of R naught, if R naught's greater than 1, that tells you the infection can spread in a population. So if you look anything really above this second to last row on this table, all of these starting at influenza, they have R naughts greater than 1. Measles, 12 to 18, definitely greater than 1. That tells you, first of all, that the infection can spread in a population, and you do have to worry about it. But if R naught is less than 1, that means that the infection is going to have trouble spreading, or it just cannot spread. So like MERS right here has an R naught value between 0.3 and 0.8. Either way, those values are less than 1, and so that tells you that MERS is going to have a lot of trouble spreading through a population. It's not going to be nearly as infectious as, let's say, AIDS or HIV, the virus that causes it, will be. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And in fact, if you look at the MERS pandemic on Wikipedia, you'll actually see that it has a relatively low amount of people who were infected by it, and that probably has to do with the fact that the R naught value is so low for MERS. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. The second thing here is determining what proportion of the population should be immunized through vaccination to eradicate a disease. Okay? So it turns out that different pathogens require different degrees of immunization in order to eradicate the disease. The higher the R naught value is, the more people have to be immunized to the disease in order for it to not spread through the population. If we're looking at something like diphtheria, which has a much lower R naught value, not as many people, or a lower percentage of people, would need to be immunized in order to prevent the spread of that disease. But something like measles or chickenpox, which has such a high R naught value, a much higher percentage of people would need to be immunized in order to prevent it spread through the population. And 2 also goes along with number 4, which gets into this math right here. Very simple math, which we'll actually do, and that will conclude the video, and hopefully this will give you a good idea of what the basic reproduction number can be good for. And so along the same lines as bullet point number 2, number 4, it tells you the proportion of the population that needs to be effectively immunized. And effectively immunized just means that they have to actually be immune to it. Okay? You can't give somebody a vaccine and the vaccine didn't work properly, or something weird or bizarre, an anomaly happens. Okay? The person has to be immune to it. But that value, that proportion of the population that must be immunized, is given as P, and P must be greater than 1 minus 1 over R naught. Okay? So that's going to give us these two equations right here. The first one, and this is actually the form I like to use for this equation, is the proportion P of the population that needs to be effectively immunized is simply equal to, you take the R naught value and subtract 1 and get a number, and then you divide by the R naught value. Okay? Now you can manipulate this equation a little bit and you get something that will give you the same answer right here. Equivalently, you can also get this proportion right here, P, by taking 1 minus the value of 1 over, or 1 divided by the R naught. Okay? I'm actually going to use this top value, but both of these will give you the same thing. Okay? And I'll also mention this, that the population proportion that still remains susceptible to the infection is given by 1 over R naught. Okay? So what I'm going to do right now to conclude the video is we're going to go to the web calculator, and I'm actually going to calculate the percentage of the population that would need to be immunized against HIV in order for the entire population to have herd immunity. And I'm using HIV for this because the R naught values are 2 to 5, really easy numbers for me to memorize when I go to the web calculator. Okay? All right, so here we are at the web calculator on Google. So remember that our formula is taking the R naught value minus 1 and then dividing by the R naught value. And that's going to give us a decimal. We can then multiply that by 100% to get it as a percent. Okay? So for HIV, the values of R naught range from 2 to 5. Okay? So let's do it first for 2. So we would simply take 2 minus 1, which is of course 1, and then we would divide that by 2, which is the original R naught value. Now, of course, 0.5 times 100% is 50%. So on the low end, 50% of people would need to be immunized in order to have herd immunity. Let's do the same calculation for the upper limit of R naught, which is 5. All right, so we'll do the same calculation. Let's get rid of that. So we'll do 5, which is the R naught value, minus 1 again. And then we're going to divide that again by 5, which is the original R naught value. That gives us 0.8, which we can then multiply by 100% to get it as a percent, and we get 80%. And so what that tells us is that in order to have herd immunity to HIV, you would have to have anywhere between 50 and 80% of people immunized against HIV. Now, the reason it's a range is because, again, there's differences in conditions, and so when you do different studies, they get different R0 values. Again, conditions and behavior alter these values a lot. Now, we can play the same game with COVID-19. Again, that's the pandemic we're going through currently, and you may have heard that in order to have herd immunity to COVID-19, roughly 70% of people would need to be immunized against this pathogen. And so what I'm going to do is, again, we're given a range here, but what I'll do is I'll take an average of these two values, 5.7 and 1.4. Okay, so how do we take an average? Well, we just do 5.7 plus 1.4 and then divide by 2. So based on those values, an average R0 value would be about 3.55. So let's do 3.55 minus 1, and then again divide by 3.55. And then I'll take this decimal, multiply it by 100%, and you can see here the value I get is about 72%. So that's actually how they do this calculation. Now, they may use more sophisticated mathematical models, but again, if I take an average of those two R0 values, I'm getting basically roughly the same thing, about 70%, if we round it to the nearest whole number. So here I have roughly 72% of the population would need to be immunized against COVID-19 in order for the population to have herd immunity. So hopefully this video gave you a good understanding of herd immunity and the basic reproduction number, and then what we can do with this number R0 in order to determine what percentage of the population needs to be effectively immunized in order to have herd immunity. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you.